71 days. That is what one Republican senator told reporters this week is left before the midterm elections, and his warning was blunt. We don't have a positive message to tell farm country. That senator was not talking about Canada's economy. He was talking about the United States, about American farmers, American ranchers, and American grocery shoppers who are watching prices climb while the White House insists everything is under control. While headlines have spent the past week focused on whether Canada would fold under 50% tariffs, the far more interesting pressure has been building somewhere else entirely, inside Trump's own party, inside his own polling numbers, and inside the wallets of the very voters who are supposed to carry Republicans through this November's elections. If you want to understand why the political weather has actually shifted onto Trump's side of this trade war rather than Canada's, and why his own senators are now breaking with him publicly just weeks before voters head to the polls, stay with this, because the pressure campaign built to punish Ottawa has quietly turned into a pressure campaign against the president who built it. This channel breaks down exactly these kinds of high-stakes financial standoffs as they unfold in real time. So hit subscribe now before we walk through exactly how this pressure shifted, because the numbers here tell a story considerably more complicated than the one being repeated in most headlines. Let's go back to where this specific standoff reached its breaking point, because the sequence explains exactly why the political fallout has landed the way it has. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law so old and so rarely used that no American president had applied it to impose an actual tariff since 1949. The 3 proclamations targeted autos, dairy, and alcohol, covering roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods annually. An additional 50% duty stacked on top of whatever tariffs already applied. Negotiators from both countries spent the following weeks working toward a deal, and when the original deadline arrived on August 19th, Trump extended it by 3 days, announcing what he called a very fair agreement was close. It was not close enough. Talks collapsed Friday night, and the 50% tariffs took effect at midnight Saturday, prompting Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to announce Canada would match the tariffs dollar for dollar beginning September 8th. This is your first real rehook, because Trump's own reaction to that collapse tells you almost everything about where the political pressure in this standoff is actually concentrated right now. Rather than framing the breakdown as a tactical setback requiring careful diplomatic recalibration, Trump went directly to social media early Sunday morning with a post that read, "Considerably more like grievance than strategy." "Canada has charged our great farmers for many years massive amounts of tariffs," he wrote, adding, "Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one. No more." That specific framing, invoking American farmers directly in a moment of visible frustration, was not accidental. It reflects exactly where the most immediate domestic political vulnerability in this entire standoff actually sits. Not in Ottawa's negotiating room, but inside farm country, among precisely the voters Trump most needs heading into a midterm election that is now less than 11 weeks away. Quick pause here, because the specific economic backdrop against which this trade war is unfolding deserves careful attention, and if you're finding this useful, this is a good moment to drop a like and subscribe, because understanding this backdrop explains why Trump's own party is reacting so differently to this standoff than it did to earlier rounds of the same conflict. Affordability has become the single dominant concern shaping how American voters view this administration's economic record. Ground beef cost an average of $6.89 a pound in July, a 57% increase since 2021, driven by a national cattle herd that has shrunk to its smallest size in 75 years, down to roughly 86 million head, according to industry tracking groups. That is not a Canada-specific problem. It predates this specific trade dispute entirely, rooted in years of drought and structural decline across American ranching. But the timing could not be worse for an administration trying to simultaneously wage a trade war against one of its largest agricultural trading partners, while also promising voters relief from exactly the kind of grocery price pressure that decline has produced. Trump's own response to that beef price problem reveals the contradiction at the center of his broader trade strategy with striking clarity. On the same Friday that talks with Canada were collapsing, Trump announced on Truth Social that the United States would allow up to 300,000 metric tons of ground beef to enter the country tariff-free over the next 90 days, specifically to bring consumer prices down, promising the imported beef would sell at 25% below current market prices. Here is the part, almost nobody covering this purely as a Canada story fully connected together. The same president simultaneously escalating a trade war against Canada, citing unfair treatment of American farmers as his central justification, was, in the very same week, moving to flood the American market with foreign beef, specifically because domestic tariff policy had helped push prices too high for voters to tolerate heading into an election. Those two positions do not sit easily next to each other, and Republican lawmakers noticed immediately that this retaliation would raise costs for Canadian consumers too. describing the decision as reluctant, even while defending it as necessary. But the asymmetry in how this pressure lands matters enormously. Canada's government does not face a midterm election in the next 11 weeks. Trump's party does. The difference in political timing gives Ottawa a genuine strategic advantage that has nothing to do with the underlying economics of the dispute and everything to do with the calendar both governments are actually operating against. Here's the numbered version of exactly where this pressure imbalance actually stands right now, because there are enough distinct threads worth separating individually to understand the full picture. First, Trump's own social media response to the collapsed negotiation, blaming Canada directly for farmer mistreatment, arrived in the same week his administration was forced to loosen tariffs on imported beef, specifically because domestic price pressure had become politically untenable, a contradiction Republican lawmakers noticed and criticized immediately and publicly. Second, internal Republican polling shared with congressional lawmakers shows affordability concerns, driven substantially by tariff-related price increases, sitting at the very top of voter priorities heading into a midterm election now less than 11 weeks away. Third, specific Republican senators and representatives in competitive, closely watched races, including Iowa, Maine, and South Dakota, have broken publicly with the administration's approach, a level of visible dissent that was considerably rarer during earlier phases of this same trade conflict. Fourth, the states facing the most direct economic exposure to this trade war substantially overlap with the states hosting the most competitive congressional races. This cycle, meaning the economic and political pressure points, are compounding each other rather than operating independently. And fifth, Canada's own government faces no equivalent electoral deadline in the coming weeks, giving Carney's team a genuine structural advantage in how much patience it can afford to display, while this specific standoff continues to play out. There is a broader lesson sitting underneath this entire episode that extends well past the specific dispute over dairy quotas and beef prices. A trade war fought primarily through tariffs functions, mechanically, as a tax collected from the country, imposing it, landing on its own importers, its own businesses, and ultimately its own consumers, not primarily on the foreign government being targeted. That mechanical reality does not disappear simply because a president frames a specific tariff proclamation as punishment directed outward at another country. When the underlying domestic conditions already include elevated grocery prices, a shrinking cattle herd, and a midterm election where affordability has become the dominant voter concern, that mechanical reality translates directly into political consequences considerably faster and considerably more visibly than it would during a period of broader economic calm. Trump's administration appears to be discovering that dynamic in real time, watching its own senators publicly criticize its signature economic tool just as the season's most consequential trade confrontation was reaching its most dramatic moment. None of this means Canada is somehow immune from real economic pain in this standoff, or that Carney's government holds every card in this negotiation. $20 billion in American tariffs are already landing on Canadian exporters this week, and $20 billion in Canadian retaliation, set to begin September 8th, will genuinely raise costs for American businesses and consumers who had no direct role in negotiating any part of this specific dispute. Both economies are absorbing real damage from this breakdown, and framing this purely as a story of American weakness would be just as inaccurate as framing it purely as a story of Canadian capitulation. What the evidence actually shows is something more precise and, in some ways, more interesting than either simple narrative. The political calendar, the specific timing of grocery price pressure, and the internal anxieties inside Trump's own party have combined to shift the balance of urgency in this standoff more heavily onto Washington's side of the table than most coverage, focused narrowly on Canada's response, has fully acknowledged. What happens over these coming weeks, as September 8th approaches and as the midterm campaign season intensifies simultaneously, will determine whether this specific pressure translates into any meaningful change in the administration's approach, or whether Trump continues framing the dispute in the same combative terms his Sunday morning social media post displayed. Republican lawmakers in competitive races are making their own calculations independently of the White House's messaging, and that independent political pressure, building specifically from inside the president's own party, rather than from Democratic opposition or from Ottawa's retaliation, may ultimately prove more consequential to how this standoff resolves than anything Canada does or does not do over the same period. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening underneath the headlines this week, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the real pressure point in this trade war may not be the one most coverage has been focused on. Drop a comment below and tell us whether you think this internal Republican pressure actually changes how the administration approaches the coming weeks, or whether the political calculus shifts back once the immediate beef price controversy fades from headlines. Share this with anyone who assumed this standoff was simply a story about Canada under pressure, because the actual polling data The actual Senate statements and the actual electoral math tell a considerably more complicated story than that. Thank you for watching, and we will be tracking exactly how this pressure develops as both the trade dispute and the midterm campaign season continue unfolding together over these coming weeks. Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, representing a state built substantially around cattle ranching, posted his reaction within hours. "This hurts," he wrote on social media. "American cattle producers have been disadvantaged for far too long." Senator Tom Cotton and Senator Tim Sheehy both pushed back publicly against the beef import plan as well. North Carolina. Senator Tom Tillis, speaking to reporters at the Capitol, delivered perhaps the bluntest assessment of the entire episode. "If you think that providing subsidized beef for some period of time is going to make farmers happy and prices go down on a systemic basis, you're wrong," he said. "It doesn't happen. We've got 71 days, and right now we don't have a positive message to tell farm country." That specific number, 71 days, is worth sitting with, because it represents Tillis doing the exact kind of electoral math every Republican strategist in Washington is now doing privately, counting down to a midterm election where the party's own internal polling shows affordability, not immigration, not crime, not foreign policy, sitting at the very top of voter concerns. Here's a rehook worth sitting with, because the polling data behind that concern is worth understanding in specific terms rather than vague political shorthand. A conservative polling firm aligned with congressional Republican leadership circulated data to Capitol Hill, showing that roughly a quarter of voters view inflation as the single most important issue facing the country, more than double the share concerned about the second-ranked issue. One Republican operative involved in the party's midterm planning put the anxiety inside the party in blunt terms to reporters. "We don't want Democrats making campaign ads about $8 Lucky Charms and grandma unable to get prescription drugs because of shortages from the tariffs," the operative said. "Voters care a ton, and Republicans need to talk more about fighting this." That comment, coming from inside the party's own strategic planning rather than from an outside critic, tells you something important. This is not primarily an opposition talking point being amplified by Democrats. It is a concern Republican strategists themselves are actively trying to manage, worried enough about its electoral impact that they are distributing internal polling specifically to convince their own colleagues to take it more seriously. That anxiety is showing up in specific competitive races right now, not just in general polling. Iowa Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, running in one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country, publicly reiterated her opposition to the beef import plan, arguing it represented exactly the kind of short-term fix that fails to address the underlying structural problem facing ranchers. Maine Senator Susan Collins, also facing a competitive re-election race, has been an outspoken opponent of the Canada tariffs, specifically since well before this most recent collapse, arguing directly that the ongoing back and forth between the two countries produces higher costs, risk, and uncertainty for businesses in her state. Notice what these specific lawmakers have in common. They are not simply ideological free traders objecting to tariffs on principle. They are politicians in competitive races watching internal polling that tells them affordability concerns could cost their party control of Congress, and calculating that public distance from this specific trade policy is now safer than public loyalty to it. Here's the part. Almost nobody covering this purely as a Canada story fully connected together, and it explains why this particular moment in the trade war carries more genuine political risk for Trump than any of the earlier rounds of this same 18-month conflict. Every previous escalation in this trade relationship happened against a considerably calmer domestic political backdrop, without a midterm election bearing down within a matter of weeks, and without the specific, visible price pressure on grocery staples like beef that has become such a potent symbol of the broader affordability debate. The timing of this particular collapse, landing just as Republican strategists are actively worried about exactly this kind of narrative taking hold with voters, transforms what might otherwise have been treated as a routine diplomatic setback into something considerably more politically dangerous for the party currently holding both chambers of Congress. There's also a structural political dimension to this pressure that extends beyond any single senator's individual electoral calculations. 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export market, a concentration considerably higher than most Americans outside those specific states typically realize. When tariffs and retaliatory tariffs disrupt that trade relationship, the economic pain does not distribute evenly or abstractly across the national economy. It concentrates specifically inside the states and industries most exposed to cross-border trade, exactly the states where competitive Senate and House races are currently being fought this cycle. Maine, with roughly $2 billion in annual non-petroleum imports from Canada, is one of those states. Iowa, deeply tied to agricultural exports, is another. South Dakota's cattle industry sits directly in the crossfire of both the original tariff dispute and the beef import controversy simultaneously. That overlap, between the states facing the most direct economic exposure to this trade war and the states hosting the most competitive races this November is precisely why individual senators are breaking from the White House's messaging so visibly and so early, well before the actual election itself. Now here's where the numbers on Canada's side matter, because understanding Ottawa's actual economic exposure helps clarify why the pressure calculus increasingly favors patience over panic for Carney's government specifically. Canada's retaliatory tariffs, set to take effect September 8th, target American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. A list constructed deliberately to spread economic pain across American states and industries with genuine political weight in Washington, rather than concentrating pressure narrowly in sectors that could be more easily dismissed. Carney himself acknowledged publicly,